I usually like to work on my own personal projects, but one of my dreams is to start a small boutique animation studio where we make proof of concept sizzle reels, animated sequences for both independent and major productions. There is a joy to adapting someone else's stories and art into an animated format that pays homage and tribute to their vision. It allows me to get out of my comfort zone, but at the same time allows me to utilize the skills I have right now. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about a recently finished animated trailer I did for Victoria Yings' graphic novel, The City of Secrets. Now for those who don't know Victoria Ying, she's an award-winning author and artist living in Los Angeles, and she's done a few stories, comics, and graphic novels. Another thing about Victoria is that she has worked in the animation industry that I'm also in. Her credits include Wreck-It Ralph, Paperman, Frozen, Big Hero 6, and Moana. There are several few that I didn't mention, so when Victoria reached me about producing an animated trailer for her upcoming comic at the time, The City of Secrets, and after seeing the art of the comic myself, as well as the comic itself, I feel like my skills and aesthetics sort of matched what she was looking for, and I was pretty stoked to do it myself. In this video, I'll talk about how I adapted an existing graphic novel for a short animated trailer. I'll be talking about an introduction, how the project got started, the pre-production, animation production, and finally a post-mortem where I share my thoughts on what could have been improved, and my general thoughts and what it was like to adapt a graphic novel or an existing story into something for animation. Before starting on the actual trailer, Victoria and I talked about what kind of trailer she kind of envisioned. Victoria is pretty chill in what she was looking for. She initially just wanted very simple scenarios, a shot where the characters just slowly morph into the cover image. And if there were other scenes, she'd be okay with just static shots of characters with hair just swaying in the background. So again, she was going for a more calmer vibe for this trailer. But from my point of view, I think it's good to try and do a 30-second trailer with different shots from the whole comic just to really sell the story and to get people invested. This is a trailer to reel people in to get interested in the story, its world, its characters, and eventually get the book. We negotiated, we talked about budget, we explored hourly rates, but then eventually we explored more fixed rates. I had to take time to calculate how long it would take me to do backgrounds, how long it would take me to do animation, what were my rough estimates for something that was 30 seconds worth of animation, and what were the necessary steps I would have to take. Would it be fully animated, or would I have to cut corners and make things more economic, therefore lowering production costs? One thing I had to realize is that my negotiation and rates change depending on many factors, whether it's a single person or if it's a company, whether I have more creative freedom on my side, spaced out deadlines, or what was the overall production value of this animated trailer. I brought up more economic animation solutions. I was initially thinking that the background for the animation was just ripped straight from the comic. While that may make the animation production cheaper and quicker to produce, I'll talk about why it was problematic and why we didn't go down that route. So after agreeing to do a 30-second trailer, I went straight to boarding. I actually storyboarded two versions of the trailer, one for 30 seconds and one for 60 seconds in case there was a surplus amount of budget and time. The other reason is that the music license I bought and acquired actually has multiple versions, so I was using a 30-second and a 60-second version of the track. I actually got the music from this website called Premium Beats, and they have a great library of licensed music. What's also great about these licenses is that they come in multiple versions. They come in shortened versions, ranging from 30 seconds to full 3-minute music pieces, as well as variations of loops that you can use. As soon as I heard the piece that I used for the trailer, I could quickly envision to what this trailer could consist of, and it really matched with Victoria's story, world, and characters. So the 30-second version of the trailer that I storyboarded just showcased the main characters, the key story arcs, and just the setting, whereas the 60-second version added juicy elements such as scenes of action and excitement. Almost all the shots are basically just ripped off the panels, and only a few are completely new additions by me, just for the animation purposes. I still had to board and lay out the overall scene so that it fits well for an animated format. I used an aspect ratio that's kind of close to a CinemaScope, just so that things felt a bit more cinematic and grander. However, all the trailers always end with the characters slowly posing into the same poses in the book cover. I showed both versions to Victoria, but our main priority was just finishing the 30 seconds because that is what we were aiming for. So with storyboards out of the way, I was ready to design and animate. So one thing I decided early on was that for the trailer, I didn't want it to look like the cover. I wanted to make it look more like the actual graphic novel itself, which is a lot more sketchier and loose, which to me would be a fun style to actually adapt. My job as someone who is producing, directing, and actually making this animated trailer is to also do my part of doing some redesign work so every scene and every bit from the comic feels consistent for the animation trailer. One thing that usually happens in a graphic novel or in comics is that the style of the character design or the drawing style changes over time as the writer and or artist works on it. And in some cases, the design changes to sell an expression better. So with the trailer, I actually wanted the visuals to remain consistent with every shot. I asked Victoria if she could send me a model or reference sheet for the character designs in terms of proportion and style. After looking at what she sent me, they still look vastly different from the actual comic, but again, even though some of the character designs don't match, the expressions really sell the overall performances and emotions of the characters. So I did kind of have to do a bit of redesigning where I would take the proportions in the character model that Victoria sent me and give it elements that allow them to give off the same facial expressions that they do in the comics. I want to pay tribute to the comic for sure, but I also have to acknowledge that this animation production needs to have a more consistent style. Animation, of course, is done in TV Paint along with cleanup, coloring, and lighting and animation. Unlike the Dream Bandits proof of concept that I released almost a year ago, the lighting and shadow effects were all hand painted, with some elements of brush strokes and cross hatching to represent both shades and lights. TV Paint is a great program for this. It allows me to just lock a layer, clip it, brush it, and it only stays within the character's silhouette. Unlike the Dream Bandits trailer where I kind of approached shading and lighting in a more cel-shaded way, this was just done with using brush strokes. And again, that's the beauty of raster-based or bitmap-based programs. It allows for more creative freedom, especially if you just want to treat frame-by-frame animation as if you were painting, whereas programs like Adobe Animate or Flash and Toon Boom Harmony, it's all vector-based and it requires you to work in a more streamlined fashion. Backgrounds are done in Photoshop. Now for this project in particular, I actually did the backgrounds first, meaning all the backgrounds had final line art and color blocking for the trailer. But I think this practice has been really good because it allows me to figure out the camera first and allows me to figure out my framing before I even start laying it out roughly in TV Paint, which has caused some problems composition wise. But what's great about doing it in Photoshop is that I'll draw a frame of where the background crops out. I save it as a rough JPEG just for TV Paint. I import it into TV Paint and I just animate my characters on top of it. I use a hot pink frame or border just to indicate again where the backgrounds begin and end. And even being able to draw elements of the characters that don't really appear in the trailer has actually been super helpful for coloring, especially in a pipeline where I do an autofill for all of the characters' line arts so they have a solid fill behind them. But the reason why this makes this automated process much easier is because there's information in where the art starts and ends. A previous problem I had before is that let's say I drew a character that kind of takes the whole vertical space of the scene, and if I were to apply a full automat of that same scene, it would fill a side of the entire shot completely filled, whereas I just want to keep that fill within that character's line art. So it did make the process faster and easier for me. As for coloring, there are multiple layers actually. The first solid fill is sort of just a gray or neutral color. Then I would apply colors for clothes in a separate layer, and then in another separate layer that would be where the flesh tones are. This is just so that it's easier for me if I need to make changes and corrections. Like I said for the backgrounds, about 90% of all the backgrounds were completely redrawn. Initially, I had the idea of just ripping off some of the assets from the actual comic and just use that for background material. But I realized that things don't really translate that well. The comic itself is much more rough and expressive, and some panels didn't have any background information, just a small indication of what it is. Whereas in this animation format, I kind of need things to be a bit more complete. So a lot of the backgrounds I had to redraw myself. I'm not a background artist, my strengths are definitely not in painting as you can see, but it's enough to match with the sensibilities that Victoria has for her graphic novel. There are about 2 backgrounds where we actually reused some of the assets for the background. One was a shot where the characters just morph into the cover image. Victoria sent me a Photoshop PSD with those assets in separate layers, but I did have to do my own editing to make it feel more ready for compositing. Some background elements were reused for the title image, as well as some of the background information for the hidden gate. So Victoria actually did some of the backgrounds herself. So in some of the background files, I drew a set of different varieties of gears, and you'll see why when I talk about compositing it in After Effects. So again, compositing is done with my favorite compositing program, Adobe After Effects. After Effects has been my crime and partner for almost all my projects. Actually, all my recent projects post 2011. So with compositing, I had to be really careful because I don't want to add too much post-filtering or effects that will make the post-processing and overall effects feel overdone. So this means avoiding a lot of gradients, avoiding glows, avoiding some color bleeding. I wanted to keep the visuals as minimal and as rough as the actual comic. Almost all the shots have a posterized filter effect going on, meaning that there's a filter that thresholds some color, so it doesn't go beyond a certain palette. That's why some of the gradients may look a bit more steppy or choppy. There were other color filters I applied, such as selective colors. Using that, I strengthened the blacks for some of the animation, and a slight tritone, and what that is that it allows me to select 3 overall colors that all the shots will have to try and sort of blend into. I set that blend amount pretty small, with a very washed out grayish blue as its darkest color, but most of its other tones were closer to a sepia tone. That allowed me to get a bit more muted colors, but giving it a bit of contrasting color so it just doesn't feel gray. But the main ones I used were the selective color and the posterized filters. Although some effects like rain I animated in TV Paint to really sell that overall rain shower, I created a fog texture and just set it as a dancing dissolve blend mode in After Effects, so all the noisy pixels just come off as dancing particles that can be used for rain droplets or a bit of dust. I learned this technique from my friend Jacob Strideline, who's done some of the most amazing student shorts and is currently an art director at Disney TV. Now remember when I mentioned that I was kind of just drawing different sorts of gears in a single PSD? Well, the reason for that is that each of these gears are going to rotate, and I can just place them all over the environment when needed. In fact, most of these shots basically just reuse the same gears. It's just that I did a ton of readjusting, such as changing their brightness, their color, their size, but I just reused a lot of assets such as gears. There were plans of implementing Blender for some of the 3D elements, but I didn't really know Blender at the time, and I still don't. I'm still learning Blender, so I would rather just focus on what my strengths are just for this project. There's a shot where Ever is standing on this giant gear and the gear is slowly rotating in perspective, but that gear isn't really just rotating, it's puppet tooled. I selected some points of that gear and just moved it and shifted it around while some parts don't move around. This is just to help sell that 3D or that illusion of depth. But at the end of the day, every shot is basically just 2D. I just moved and animated background assets so they give off that illusion of 3D. Objects closer to the screen will move much more significant, where objects far into the background will have minimal movement. I had to do a lot of parenting and grouping for the backgrounds, and animate each part carefully so they feel 3D. This part was the hardest to do, especially in the bit where Hannah jumps off a platform and she's falling through gears. This shot is entirely done in 2D. But I had to cue some gears to move slower or faster in certain moments of time. Actually, this shot was never in the storyboard version. The storyboard had a much more mundane and I would say boring shot of the 2 characters just running through obstacles, running through the foreground and such, but I thought that was, again, pretty boring, so I had to come up with something more dynamic and engaging and fun. There's a scene where 2 characters are running at night. In the storyboard version, it's closer to the comic where it's a flat side proscenium shot, whereas in this animated shot, I made it have more depth, I Dutch angled it, and just gave it more of that illusion of 3D camera rotation. So if you can get away with just cheating your 3D camera moves with just using a 2D plane, do it, it'll save a lot more time. Because adding a Z-axis or adding a 3D environment will just have more problems for you to solve. So remember originally I said that this trailer was actually just supposed to be about 30 seconds long? Well, that's what I sent Victoria. I sent Victoria the 30-second version of the trailer with finished shots, but then I also sent her some work in progress of what a 60-second version of the trailer would look like with rough animation. After showing her those two versions, she actually responded pretty positively for the rough 60-second version, and she asked if it was possible to finish the remaining 30 seconds of the trailer. So we did have to talk about negotiation again. To do extra footage that's twice as long as what we intended for, normally I would just double the cost, but the extra budget we were willing to work with was just under the double amount of the cost. So this was where I had to really think about ways to make the remaining shots much more economic and less expensive. So the shots for the intended 30-second trailer had more detailed animation, a lot more twos, and had more complete backgrounds along with background animation. But the remaining 30 seconds would have to have looser animation, less detailed backgrounds, and overall less drawings for the animation. So I had to research anime and how they got away with using drawings that hold for 3 frames, more economic animation styles, and how do I cheat certain elements. I'm honestly glad that I actually did the last 30 seconds of the trailer because I actually learned a lot from it. The extra footage allowed me to experiment. Since me and Victoria, we decided that the remaining shots didn't have to be as polished as the first shots that we did intended for the 30-second trailer. But what ended up happening is that all the experimentation led to me finding solutions and how to make things work, even if it is economic. Some of my friends actually said that the last remaining footage that I did looked much better than the first footages I did for the trailer. Because the experimentation led me to push things a lot more, stylize things a lot more, and really play around with the character designs. Whereas the first animation I did, although it was good, did feel a bit safe. You can tell that some drawings feel loose since I spent less time on them. But I actually had the most fun working with these shots because again, it allowed me to be more free and less restricted from the actual designs that I set out to work with. This is just a statement of me saying, don't underestimate the places where you have to be more economic or cheaper, because it does allow you to be more problem solving and experimental, which leads to newer discoveries for tackling an animation. But you know what, that's also not always the case, because it also includes factors such as creative freedom, time, all these other things that might give you little or a lot of room for these sorts of experimentations. So this is where I felt like I wasn't just making a trailer and making a polished trailer, but also utilizing my skills where I could be creative and add my own flair to it. Again, some of the storyboards were more static and flat, whereas in these finished shots, I actually made them more dynamic and more pushed. And honestly, I'm really glad about how it turned out. Especially that this was kind of done in a certain amount of time, and it was pretty much done entirely by myself. So now that the trailer has been done for over 2 weeks now, I do have some few things to talk about in terms of a post-mortem, what I could have done better, and if there were things that I wish I could go back to and fix. The first and foremost being is that I wish I got to work more with the character design so it felt more like Victoria and the City of Secrets book. And this is something I realized when I reread some of the last pages of the actual graphic novel. It's usually the last pages of the graphic novel where the artist and the author really hones in on the style of the characters and the art direction. And that's where it's most tight and solid. And to come up with character design that works best for the overall comic for the animation, I should have just heavily referenced those last pages. Since the earlier pages of the City of Secrets graphic novel, the character design is still trying to find itself. So things like overall design changes, proportion changes, but that's really the nature of graphic novels, especially if they're done in a long period of time. Some of the expressions actually work when the character design does change a bit. But then it's usually the later pages of the graphic novel where the character designs have kind of found their own design. So if I were to go back, I would actually make the character designs for the animation much closer to those later pages, since the designs for the animation right now feel a bit too much like my style. And honestly, I kind of wanted it to be closer to Victoria Yings' style. The second being better sound design. Sound design isn't really a big priority of mine, especially if it's for smaller projects. But it's usually the sound that makes everything feel like it has more depth, and I probably could have just worked with a sound designer for that. The third being that there are some mistakes in the actual animation. Like one of the frames where the character skips in some of the animation. There's a frame where Ever is uncolored in terms of coloring, and just other animation mistakes here and there. The fourth element that could be improved, especially in future projects, is more about the planning and part of the negotiation part. When I was kind of giving my estimates, I kind of underestimated the amount of work needed to complete a certain task. So there were some steps and tasks that I initially thought would have taken me faster and much less energy, but it ended up being much longer and much more difficult. Again, one of the key elements was that I initially thought that I was going to reuse background assets from the actual comic itself. Or some of the animation that I thought would be simple to do ended up being more complex than I initially thought. But that's also because I lack certain experience when handling these type of shots. And honestly, you won't have a clear idea in how to plan or how to negotiate until you've actually had freelance and commissioning experience. That's something that I don't really do, or I rarely do. Honestly, I would say that I don't really do it at all. I kind of just focus on personal projects. Another big thing that I had to work with was working with one-time payments or major increments, whereas I'm more used to hourly pay or even weekly pay. I feel safer that way. But people who want to commission me in the future may feel safer if they know the full price beforehand. So that's also something that I also need to be prepared for in terms of future commissions. But because of this project, now I know, and this experience is something that I could use and improve on a later project. But other than that, I'm generally happy with most of the comments I've been getting for the trailer, the initial reactions to it, and I hope it did its job in terms of selling the world and story of City of Secrets. What's important is that it's done. If I really didn't have any deadline and I just spent a lot of time just polishing every single shot, I probably wouldn't have finished it. But I had to be strict with the deadline for myself. It was actually initially due about 2 months later, but I wanted to finish things 2 months earlier because I was going to take up a new gig. So again, setting deadlines is super important, especially if you just want to get something done. So there you have it, that was the making of the City of Secrets animated trailer. I hope you guys found this somewhat helpful or somewhat useful, but every time I finish an animated project, the experience is always different and I always have different mindsets on it. The overall pipeline may be the same from my previous projects, but the overall approach, the execution, and thoughts on the direction always changes. Unlike my Dream Bandits proof of concept trailer, that was just done entirely by myself. It's my own personal project, and there was no funding for it. But this project was actually my first time, doing most of the negotiation, doing most of the directing, and making most of the decision making while working with the actual author of the comic or the graphic novel itself. So that was the biggest takeaway from it. I started seeing myself more as an animation service and a business, and my thoughts on approaching that in general. Eventually, I want to make more trailers or more animated content for other artists and authors. I do know that I still want to prioritize on my own personal projects and my own stories, but projects like these actually get me out of my comfort zone and it helps me grow, since sometimes I feel like all my personal projects may be stagnant and may just lead me to repeating the same old habits again and again. And doing projects like these where I'm commissioned by another person or an overall company is another great way for me to find new challenges. Anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for hearing me out, and I'll see you guys next time. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.